October 1942. The winter wind whistled across the fields south of England, carrying the smell of oil and gunpowder from the mud-choked runways of the United States Army Air Forces. At Chelveston Airfield, the engines of the B-17 Flying Fortress roared in waves as the giant bombers taxied and took off, trailing plumes of grey smoke through a leaden sky. When the sun rose, those roars faded to the east, headed for Germany. And then, as if by a fate that repeated day after day in the afternoon, the sky would once again ring with splintering engines as the flying fortresses returned their fuselages pocked and smoking, and inside them young men dripping blood. In a field surgical tent set right at the edge of the runway, Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow, a surgeon in the U.S. Army Air Forces, leaned over an operating table. He had lost count of how many wounds he had stitched, how many slivers of metal he had cut from bodies over the past months. Under the weak yellow lamp, his hands were slick with sweat and blood. Outside, the air raid siren sounded again, signaling another forced landing. A nurse opened the curtain. 2 orderlies carried in a stretcher bearing a young pilot, face ashen, flight jacket torn, blood soaking from his chest down to his hip. Grow took a quick look and guessed immediately it wasn't from machine gun fire. The wound was too large, and there was no straight-through puncture. When he cleaned away the blood, he found a small, darkened shard of metal embedded in the wound, its edge jagged like broken teeth. He plucked it out and laid it on a tray. It rang with a metallic chime. It was a piece of anti-aircraft shell, the weapon that had killed thousands of American airmen in a matter of months. Not the 20mm bullets from German fighters, but tiny fragments of steel hurled outward when shells detonated in mid-air, punching through the thin skins of aircraft and shredding the flesh of the men inside. That night, after the last surgery, Grow sat alone in the medical ward in front of the tray full of metal he had pulled from pilots' bodies. Some pieces were as large as coins, some tiny as pinheads. All were as sharp as razors. He held one up to the light. The lamp made it flash like a cold steel cut. Are we losing men to things like this? He asked himself. Grow had seen combat wounds in World War I when he was a young physician on the Western Front. He knew well what machine gun fire could do, but what he had been seeing at Chelveston was different. Most of the casualties among bomber crews were not from direct hits, but from low-velocity shrapnel, fragments powerful enough to tear skin, shred muscle, and sever arteries, but not powerful enough to pass cleanly through bone or steel armor. That meant these injuries were preventable if there were the right kind of protection. The numbers in the base casualty logs haunted him. 70% of the deaths were from wounds to the chest and abdomen, heads, arms, legs. Many of these areas were already protected by helmets or thick flight jackets, but the torso was largely exposed. Pilots sat immobilized in the cockpit, harness straps across their shoulders, surrounded by glass, thin metal, and waiting shards. They could not dodge, could not duck. They could only hope the next fragment would not strike their body. Grow realized that if he wanted to reduce fatalities, he had to stop the wounds from happening in the first place. He could not only wait for patients to arrive at his operating table. In his journal he wrote, "I can stitch dozens in a day, but so long as they sit bare before flying metal, I am only mending what has already been broken. We need a way for them not to be wounded to begin with." From that thought, a concept slowly took shape. Armor for pilots. At first, the idea sounded crazy. Armor. In the modern world of heavy bombers, who spoke of armor? That belonged to medieval times, to knights and iron swords. But Grow did not see it that way. He had read about historical armor, particularly a kind called brigandine, a type of jacket from the 14th, 15th centuries made of many small steel plates sewn into fabric or leather, forming a flexible protective layer that could take a blow while still allowing movement. He believed that applying the same principle with modern steel might produce a light, flexible, and strong layer capable of stopping shrapnel. In the days that followed, while the base continued to receive the wounded, Grow quietly sketched his first design. On the back of an old medical record, he drew a human figure and marked the vital zones in red: chest, abdomen, lower ribs, groin. He estimated plate thicknesses, noted fabric types and stitching methods. He experimented with materials on hand, cartridge box steel plates, scraps from damaged aircraft panels, even pieces from engine cowling. He and a few nurses cut, bent, hammered, and sewed samples onto an old flight jacket. What they produced looked crude, but it was the first prototype of a pilot's armor. When Grow presented the idea to his superiors, the initial reaction was laughter. "Armor for pilots? Going to turn them into knights of the air?" A colonel half joked, half sneered. Command worried that armor would be too heavy, would hamper movement in the cockpit, increase fatigue, even affect aircraft performance. And mass-producing an unproven item in wartime seemed nearly impossible. Grow did not argue. He said only, "They are dying from shrapnel. I just want to prove we can save them." He asked for a small privilege, permission to test it himself. No large budget, no formal approval, just a few weeks and a small support team. Command reluctantly agreed, perhaps sure the idea would fail. But that decision opened the way for one of the war's most consequential life-saving inventions. That night, Grow returned to the operating room and looked about. On the table lay surgical instruments. Beside them, the tray of metal fragments and a torn flight jacket. He took a pencil and sketched an arc on the wooden table to represent a chest plate. If each of these bits of steel could be stopped where it pierced, he thought, how many fewer men would be lying here? From the blood-scented, antiseptic-tinged operating tent, the idea was born. Simple, almost instinctive. Save lives by preventing the projectile from ever reaching them. But it would change not only the fate of thousands of flyers, it would help shape the development of personal protective technology for the century to come. At Chelveston, the winter mornings remained bitter. The bombers still roared when the strike groups took off, and Grow continued his daily work, stitching, patching, saving lives, recording notes. None of them knew that between scalpel strokes and sirens, a quiet revolution was taking root. A revolution not forged in an armaments factory, but at a surgeon's table, by a man who believed that sometimes a life could be saved with nothing more than a thin piece of steel. As winter slowly faded from the grey skies over England, the squadrons of B-17s still took off day after day, heading for the fire-filled skies of Germany. And every day, more flying fortresses returned battered and broken, carrying the wounded and the dead. Colonel Malcolm Cummings Grow knew he could wait no longer. His idea of a pilot's armor was no longer just a theory in his mind. It had become a moral imperative. But turning an idea into reality was another matter entirely. Grow had no factory, no budget, not even special materials. All he had were a few dedicated nurses, some aircraft mechanics from the maintenance unit, and an unshakable belief that what he was envisioning could save lives. In the evenings, after surgeries, he and his small team gathered in an old storage shed on the base, the lamplight flickering against the walls. They stripped metal plates from wrecked aircraft, cut them into smaller pieces with iron shears, and tried sewing them into thick canvas. The first plates were far too rigid. The vests were so heavy no one could move in them. They thinned the steel, curved it to fit the body. Once, when Grow tried one on and bent forward, the plates clattered together like the armor of a medieval knight. He laughed, but he also knew he was getting closer. One night, while reviewing his sketches, Grow remembered the books on medieval armor he had read back in medical school. One type, called brigandine, wasn't made of large, rigid plates like a knight's cuirass, but of hundreds of small steel pieces sewn beneath fabric or leather, flexible enough to bend, yet strong enough to turn a blade. He opened his notebook and began to redesign the vest on that principle, dividing it into sections, each with overlapping steel scales like the natural armor of a fish or reptile. He told himself, if men in the Middle Ages could ride and fight in such armor, then pilots can certainly fly in a lighter version of it. The next morning, he went to the base machine shop to see Lieutenant John Harris, the officer in charge of aircraft maintenance. "I need steel that's thin, light, and can bend without breaking," Grow said. Harris scratched his head. That kind of metal only exists in an English swordsmith's forge. That half-joke stopped Grow cold. A swordsmith's forge, of course. Why not go to them? A few weeks later, Grow was in London. The city was still dark under blackout orders, but he made his way to the headquarters of the Wilkinson Sword Company, famous for centuries of crafting swords, knives, and more recently, razors. It was their metallurgical skill that Grow sought. He laid out his drawings before Thomas Latham, Wilkinson's technical director, and explained his plan. Latham studied the sketches in silence for a long while, then said, "You want armor that's light, flexible, yet hard enough to stop shell fragments? That won't be easy, but if it can save lives, we'll try." And so an unlikely alliance was born, an American flight surgeon and a British sword-making company. In Wilkinson's Chelsea workshop, veteran smiths began experimenting with different steels. They settled on ductile manganese steel about 1 millimeter thick, strong enough to withstand impact but far lighter than standard armor plate. The small plates were cut, polished, overlapped, and sewn into layers of heavy olive green fabric. When the first prototype was finished, Grow lifted it and felt its weight, about 10 kilograms, half the mass of his earlier attempts. He tried it on, bent, raised his arms, the armor flexed with his movements. "Not bad," he said. "But will it really stop shrapnel?" The answer came the next day in a field test. They hung the vest on a wooden frame and fired 20-millimeter shell fragments at it. When the smoke cleared, the plates were dented but intact. No fragment had pierced the inner lining. Grow picked up the vest, his hands trembling slightly. "It works," he whispered. "It actually works." Word spread quickly through the base. When he brought a few samples back to Chelveston, the pilots crowded around to see. One joked, "Guess we're knights of the air now." Grow smiled. "As long as you live to tell the tale," he replied. "I don't care what they call us." But Wilkinson couldn't produce them in quantity. Their craftsmen still hand-forged each piece, taking nearly a week to make one vest. Grow needed a bigger partner, someone who could standardize and mass-produce the design. He sent a full report to Washington, complete with test photos. This time, the U.S. Army Air Forces didn't laugh. The casualty statistics from Chelveston spoke for themselves. Since the armor trials began, fatal injuries had dropped sharply. Headquarters immediately approved further production and ordered Grow back to the United States to refine the design. Returning to Washington in early 1943, Grow brought several armor samples and dozens of shell fragments he had personally extracted from pilots, living proof of why those steel plates mattered. He was assigned a team of engineers and materials experts to develop an improved, lighter version. But the help that advanced the project most came not from military engineers, it came from a museum. While studying historical armor structures, Grow contacted the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, home to hundreds of classic European suits of armor. The museum's restoration specialists, experts in the joining and weight distribution of medieval armor, were fascinated. They examined Grow's blueprints and invited him to their restoration workshop. In a room filled with the ring of hammers and the scent of metal, surrounded by the armor of Renaissance knights, a new kind of project began. The conservators analyzed how to distribute the plates, weight across the shoulders and hips to avoid pressure on the abdomen. They suggested using smaller, triangular or scale-shaped plates instead of large squares to improve flexibility. One of them joked, "We used to make armor for kings. Now we were helping make it for pilots." Grow laughed, but he knew they were together writing a new chapter in the history of armor. The finished version, called the Model M1 Flak Suit, weighed only about 8–9 kilograms. The chest and abdomen were protected by main plates joined to side and groin panels, all sewn securely into olive green fabric that looked little different from a regular flight jacket. When worn, it felt slightly stiff but allowed full movement. Pilots could still turn, bend, and climb into their bombers. Grow requested combat testing. A B-17 squadron in England was selected to wear the M1 during bombing missions. After several weeks, the field reports astonished everyone. In 30 direct hits from shell fragments to the armored areas, not a single fatality occurred. Some men suffered bruises, but the armor had stopped every piece of shrapnel. One pilot recalled, "I felt a heavy smack, thought I was done for. When we landed, I looked down and saw just a dent, no blood." From that point on, Grove's idea was no longer a private experiment. It became an official U.S. Army Air Forces project. Headquarters ordered mass production, and Grove was tasked with refining newer versions, the M2, M3, each lighter, stronger, and easier to remove for air combat. Sometimes, watching young airmen put on the armor he had conceived, Grove thought back to those nights in the Chelveston Field Hospital, where the idea first came to him amid blood and smoke. Now those thin plates of steel had left the forge and risen into Europe's skies, ready to catch the flying fragments and, more importantly, keep those young hearts beating. The armor Grove created was more than a piece of protective gear. It was the embodiment of a simple truth he had always believed, that in war, sometimes a humane idea can be stronger than any weapon. Spring, 1943. Across the skies of Europe, the B-17 formations still stretched in endless shimmering lines, glinting in the morning sun before disappearing into the clouds, bound for Berlin, Bremen, Hamburg, names that had become synonymous with danger. Somewhere far below, in bunkers and steel workshops, another battle was being fought, a battle to keep alive the men flying above. And at its center stood one man, still relentlessly pursuing what many officers had once dismissed as fantasy: armor for airmen. After the first prototype proved effective in trials with Wilkinson's sword, Grove was recalled to the United States to expand the project, but he knew he couldn't do it alone. Wilkinson were masters of steelcraft, but they were still a handcrafting company. Each suit took a week to make. Grove had to industrialize the design, turning a few dozen experimental sets into thousands, enough to equip every bomber crew. He returned to Washington carrying several sample vests and a small wooden crate filled with something unusual: hundreds of jagged shell fragments he had extracted from airmen' S-bodies during his months at Chelveston. He called them steel killers. To him, each fragment was living proof of why men needed armor. At the Pentagon, Grove presented his results before a U.S. Army Air Forces technical board. When he projected a photo of an M1 vest deeply dented but not pierced, the room fell silent. One officer bent over his notes and muttered, "We're talking about something that could save thousands." Within days, the project was approved. Grove was granted funding, personnel, and authorization to collaborate with any civilian unit necessary, and thus began one of the strangest alliances of the war. The first partner remained Wilkinson Sword Company, the birthplace of it all. The smiths who had once forged gleaming sabers now hammered out small, hand-sized steel plates, polished them, and sewed them between layers of heavy canvas. Each day their workshop rang with the clang of hammers and the smell of oil, not the forge of swords for officers, but of shields for airmen. An old blacksmith named Allen told Grove, "All my life I've made weapons to kill. Now, at last, I'm making something to save." The words left Grove speechless. But Wilkinson alone could not meet the scale of thousands. Grove needed an American partner, someone capable of true industrial production. The problem? In the U.S., no company had ever mass-produced body armor. Armor had vanished from warfare for centuries. While he searched for a way forward, an unexpected suggestion came from a materials professor at Columbia University. If you want to understand how to distribute weight and how steel can flow around the human form, go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Their arms and armor department is the best study collection in the world. It sounded strange, but Grove was used to finding answers in unlikely places. So one May morning, the Army surgeon stepped into the grand building on Fifth Avenue, home to humanity's artistic treasures. He was led down to the basement, into the armor restoration room. The air smelled of old metal. Among the gleaming suits of medieval knights, craftsmen worked patiently with tiny hammers and steel brushes. They were artisans from a bygone age, and now they were about to help write a new chapter of modern war. The department's director, Helmut Nickel, greeted Groh with a gentle smile. After hearing the surgeon's account of the project, he pondered a while, then said, "You know, the principle you're after has existed since the 15th century. Plate armor wasn't just for stopping blades. It was about dispersing impact. We can show you how to make the steel flow around the body instead of fighting against it." Groh spread his prototype across the table. Nickel and his colleagues leaned over, running their hands along each plate. They quickly saw the flaws. The plates were too large, the overlaps uneven, making the vest stiff and restrictive. An Italian restorer, who had once worked on the armor of the Duke of Milan, remarked, "Think like a tailor, not a blacksmith. Each plate should be a fold, not a wall." That one sentence changed the entire direction of the design. In the following weeks, Groh worked side by side with Nickel's team. They used life-sized body casts to map where the greatest forces struck a seated pilot, especially the chest, abdomen, and groin. They shrank each plate to just 3 to 4 centimeters, overlapping them like fish scales instead of stacking them in rows. The result was a vest that moved with the body, distributing weight evenly across shoulders and hips without pressing into the spine or belly. When the final version was completed, the group stood in awe. The vest's outer layer was olive khaki fabric. Inside lay hundreds of dull, burnished steel plates. In the hand, it weighed about 8 to 9 kilograms, 30% lighter than Wilkinson's first model. Nickel said, half proud, half moved, "It is remarkable to see an ancient craft reborn to save lives in the age of airplanes." Groh brought the prototype to Wright Field, the Air Force's testing center, where all new equipment faced trial before the front lines. The first test took place on a range in Ohio. The vest was hung on a wooden frame 30 meters from a 20mm cannon. The shell exploded. Smoke billowed. Groh held his breath. When the technician approached, he shouted, "No penetration, just a dent." The team cheered like children. Subsequent tests were even more impressive. Shell fragments, striking at angles, bounced off like pebbles hitting stone. Small caliber rounds pierced the outer cloth, but stopped at the second steel layer. Reports noted, protective efficiency for chest and abdomen, 85–90%. Direct fatality reduction, approximately 70%. When the data reached Washington, Air Force Command approved the design immediately. The armor was officially designated M1 Flak Suit. The first order, 20,000 sets, was placed with Wilkinson and several U.S. metallurgical plants for joint production. Over the following months, a collaboration unlike any other unfolded. Surgeon, blacksmith, museum conservator, and aircraft engineer, each playing a part. Wilkinson forged the plates. Textile mills in Massachusetts sewed the fabric shells. The Met's armor department advised on articulation and comfort, and Groh, at the center, was doctor, coordinator, and the soul of the entire effort. He traveled constantly between factories, watching workers stitch each plate by hand and testing the suits himself. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "It's strange, my dear. The men who once made swords now make armor. The artists who preserve relics now teach us how to save pilots. If someone had told me that war could bring together such different souls, I wouldn't have believed it." By late summer 1943, the first shipments of M1 armor arrived in England. At Chelveston, the place where it had all begun, Groh stood on the airfield watching wooden crates stenciled "Protective Armor, Aircrew" being unloaded. He said nothing, just rested his hand for a long moment on the words. That evening, as the crews prepared for a bombing run over Hamburg, Groh personally helped them don the new vests. A young pilot grinned, "Doc, this thing's heavy, but if it keeps me alive, I'll wear 2. Groh laughed, gripping the man's shoulder. "Just come back and tell me about it." When the B-17s vanished into the night, Groh stood silently watching their fading lights, filled with the quiet conviction that he had done something that truly mattered. Not with medicine or scalpels, but with something simpler. A few steel plates, a few stitches, and an idea born from pain. That day at Shelveston, no one realized they were witnessing the birth of the first modern flight armor in history. And from that moment on, every American airman who took off carried not only bombs and bullets, but also a strange, precious legacy forged from three worlds that were never meant to meet: medicine, metallurgy, and art. Autumn 1943. On the windswept airfields of England, the roar of Wright Cyclone engines filled the day and night. American airmen prepared for an unusual mission, not just because they were about to fly into German skies, but because they were wearing something no one had ever seen before: armor. At first, most of them were skeptical. To the imagination of a flyer, armor evoked images of clumsy, lumbering knights, something alien to the world of aircraft and bombs. "We're supposed to fly, not crawl," one nose gunner joked when Grow introduced the vest. But when Grow tapped lightly on the thin steel plates beneath the khaki fabric, a firm clack rang out. He said calmly, "You can't dodge a bullet. But now, at least, you have a chance to live and tell the story." So they tried. The first M1 armored vests were issued to the crews of the 91st and 303rd Bomb Groups, two of the hardest-hit units in the daylight bombing campaign over Germany. Each man received a set: a vest protecting the chest and abdomen, a groin guard, and a small neck plate. Total weight, nearly 9 kilograms, but removable when needed. On October 8, 1943, the 91st Bomb Group flew to Bremen. 30 B-17s plunged into a storm of flak, where German guns painted the sky with dense black clouds. Grow, now a lieutenant colonel, waited in the Shelveston radio room, staring silently at the map where glowing dots crept across it. He knew that each dot represented dozens of lives. When the first planes returned, people noticed something extraordinary. Casualties had dropped dramatically. Previously, a long-range raid cost 20–30% of crews wounded or killed by flak. That day, only a few suffered minor injuries, and most owed their lives to the armor. A tail gunner stepped down, his face blackened with soot. A coin-sized dent marked his chest plate. He pulled off the vest and held it up to Grow. "This thing saved me. The shell hit hard. Felt like my ribs cracked, but that's all." Grow looked at the dent and felt his chest tighten. Not from sorrow, but from the realization that his idea had become a living life saved. The mission report stated, "M1 armor, highly effective. 20mm fragments did not penetrate. Does not restrict operation." From that day, requests for equipment surged. The 8th Air Force decided to issue armor to every heavy bomber crew. But as the program scaled up, new problems appeared. British factories couldn't meet the demand, and shipping steel from the US was slow. Grow flew constantly between London and Washington, pressing the War Department to prioritize materials for the body armor for aircrews program. Then an unexpected ally emerged: DuPont's Materials Research Division. They offered to help test synthetic fiber linings to lighten the armor. From that collaboration came the M1A, a lighter, more breathable version that could be quickly removed in emergencies. In January 1944, Grow returned to Europe with a new mission: to evaluate real combat effectiveness. For 3 months, he traveled from Bassingbourn to Thorpe Abbotts, interviewing hundreds of airmen and documenting every survival case. The data he compiled would later become a landmark in military medical research. The results were stunning. Flak-related fatalities decreased by 63%. Abdominal wounds dropped by 75%. Out of 220 recorded hits, only 11 fully penetrated the armor. Commanders were astonished. One senior U.S. Air Force officer wrote in his report, "The M1 armor represents the most significant medical and technical advancement in air warfare since the invention of the oxygen mask." From then on, the vest became mandatory equipment for all bomber crews entering hostile airspace. Any crew flying without it was considered in violation of safety orders. Photos from Thorpe Abbotts show long lines of airmen fastening their armor before takeoff, each man bowing his head to check the straps, a ritual of survival. By the summer of 1944, as Operation Overlord loomed, every B-17 and B-24 bomber supporting the Normandy campaign carried M1 armor on board. During those tense weeks, Grow was stationed in England, moving from base to base, adjusting designs for the humid summer weather. One night, in a field tent, he received a telegram from the 92nd Bomb Group. Tonight's mission: aircraft number 231 hit by flak. Entire crew survived. Shell entered cockpit, stopped by pilot's armor. He read the message over and over, then folded it carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. He would keep that scrap of paper for the rest of his life. But success carried its cost. In many missions, though the armor saved lives, crews still suffered internal injuries from the blunt force of impacts. Grow began collaborating with surgeons to add rubber padding inside the vest to absorb kinetic shock, marking the birth of the modern concept of energy-dissipating liners. By mid-1944, as the war pushed into Germany, Grow was recalled to Washington to deliver his final report. At the Pentagon briefing, his first slide showed two images: a blood-soaked uniform torn apart and an M1 vest with a deep dent at its center. He said simply, "Gentlemen, the difference between these two pictures is the difference between death and life." The room was silent. After a pause, the chairman murmured, "Lieutenant Colonel Grow, America owes you more than you know." From that moment, the M1 armor was standardized across the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. Production expanded to Connecticut, where Wilkinson partnered with General Motors to manufacture tens of thousands of units each month. Before long, the armor spread beyond bomber crews. Naval anti-aircraft gunners, tank crews, even frontline medics began receiving modified versions. What began as a peculiar Air Corps experiment had become a symbol of a new era, one in which soldiers no longer went to war in thin cloth, but in protection designed to preserve life. Grow never saw himself as a hero. In a short 1945 interview, he said simply, "I didn't invent armor. I just brought it back, because my men needed it." But to the airmen whose lives were saved, he was a silent savior. After the war, letters began arriving at the military hospital where he worked. Handwritten, shaky, heartfelt. One from a tail gunner aboard the B-24 Liberty Bell read, "Flak tore through the tail, blew everything apart, except me. When I woke up, your vest was still on me. It had a hole, but I didn't. Thank you for giving me a chance to come home." Grow read every letter carefully and stored them in a small wooden box on his desk. He kept no medals, no plaques, only those words, proof of what he had believed from the very beginning, that medicine could save lives not only in hospitals, but also amid the fire and smoke of the skies. By the end of 1944, more than 100,000 M1 armor vests had been produced and distributed across all theaters of war. Bomber crew casualties dropped from 4.5 wounded per aircraft to fewer than 2. Command reports called it one of the most life-saving innovations of World War II. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, Grow returned to Washington. Walking down the long corridors, he passed the bronze plaques engraved with the names of the fallen. He stopped, placed a hand on the cold metal. In that moment, he saw no ranks, no victories, only the faces of the young airmen he had once promised to protect. And he had kept that promise. From the operating room at Chelveston to the test ranges of Ohio, from Wilkinson E.S. Forge to the Armor Hall of the Metropolitan Museum, every path had led to the same goal, a thin layer of steel standing between man and death. The M1 armor was more than a piece of equipment. It was a reminder that even in war, amid explosions and darkness, there are those who choose to save rather than destroy. And sometimes, a simple idea, to protect life, can change the very way humanity goes to battle. May 1945. The last guns in Europe had fallen silent. Smoke slowly thinned across the German sky. On the runway at Chelveston, once alive with the roar of thousands of missions, only rusting B-17s remained, lying still like weary birds. Amid that quiet landscape, Colonel Malcolm Grow returned, walking slowly past the empty barracks, Everything was still there. The small surgery room where he had once operated on dozens of men in a single day, the wooden desk where he had first sketched the outline of the M1 armor vest. But there were no more sirens, no more cries of pain, only the wind, carrying the faint scent of smoke and steel. Grow stopped by the wall where he had once pinned up mission maps. Now only red tacks and broken lines remained. He removed the small sign reading Chelveston Air Station and slipped it into his pocket. To him, this war had never just been a struggle between nations. It was a struggle between death and the stubborn will of the living. When Grow returned to Washington, he was welcomed as a hero. He received the Distinguished Service Medal and was appointed Surgeon General of the U.S. Army Air Forces, responsible for shaping the entire post-war system of aerospace medicine. Yet when reporters asked him about his invention, the body armor, he simply smiled and said, "If I'm a hero, then the real heroes are the thousands of blacksmiths, nurses, engineers, and airmen who made the miracle happen. I was just the one who asked, why do we accept that they have to die this way?" That question became Grow's lifelong philosophy. He spent the rest of his career transforming aviation medicine from a patchwork of improvisations into a rigorous scientific system, one that emphasized not only healing, but prevention and protection. After the war, Grow led research to improve armor for ground troops. From the M1 prototype, he worked with engineers to develop the M12 and M52 flak jackets using lightweight alloys and fiberglass, early versions of the protective gear worn by American soldiers in Korea and Vietnam. The principles he had pioneered, force dispersion, body contouring, and kinetic energy absorption, later became the foundation for Kevlar body armor in the 1970s. But Grow's legacy was more than steel and fabric.
He changed how the military valued human life. Before World War II, pilot casualties were often viewed as inevitable. Grow shattered that fatalism with his conviction that every life was worth protecting at any cost. When he presented his 1946 report, Human Factors in Air Combat, his opening line stunned the audience into silence.
"We can build aircraft that fly faster than sound, but if we forget the heartbeat inside them, we are only building aluminum coffins." That report led to the creation of the Grow Aeromedical Research Center, dedicated to studying all aspects of pilot health, pressure, sound, and even psychological trauma. He was the first to introduce the concept of combat stress into Air Force training, treating mental health as an essential, invisible form of armor. The more people learned about Grow, the more they were struck by his humility. He never called himself an inventor. "I only reconnected the broken link between knowledge and compassion," he once said. When asked why he never patented the body armor, he replied simply, "You can't put a price on human life." In 1947, when the U.S. Air Force became an independent branch, Grow was among those who founded its medical service. He designed systems for mobile hospitals, in-flight emergency care, and aerial rescue operations, procedures still in use today. In every meeting, he reminded his staff of Chelveston's lesson: don't wait for blood to be spilled before thinking of how to save it. Prepare in advance, with steel, with medicine, with knowledge. By 1949, Grow had been promoted to Major General, one of the first medical officers in Air Force history to reach that rank. Yet in his small office, he remained the same modest doctor. On his desk sat a wooden box filled with shrapnel fragments he had once pulled from the bodies of airmen, along with faded letters of thanks. Anyone who visited was shown the box. He would pick up a fragment and say softly, "This is why I do what I do." Old age never slowed him down. He continued to teach at the Armed Forces Medical School, training the first generation of U.S. flight surgeons. His students affectionately called him Old Armor Doc. They recalled how, when lecturing about barotrauma or impact injuries, he would pause to tell stories of the tail gunner saved over Bremen, of the Wilkinson blacksmiths, of the morning he walked into the armor hall at the Metropolitan Museum. "Science," he would say, "doesn't only live in laboratories. It lives wherever compassion does." Grow retired in 1953 at the age of 68. He spent his remaining years quietly on the Maryland coast, sitting each morning on a wooden chair, reading letters from former airmen. He could never answer them all, but he carefully filed each one by year. Once, he told his closest student, "I've seen more men die than live. But whenever I remember those I managed to save, even one, I know my life wasn't in vain." In 1960, when invited to the Smithsonian's exhibit, Inventions That Changed War, Grow appeared in a simple gray suit. As the guide led him through displays of atomic bombs and jet engines, he suddenly stopped. Before him stood a worn M1 armor vest, slightly tarnished, beside a small plaque. Protective armor for aircrews, designed under the direction of Colonel Malcolm C. Grow, 1943. He stood for a long time, his hand trembling as he touched the frayed fabric. The curator asked softly, "Sir, would you like to leave a message for visitors?" Grow thought for a moment, then wrote in a wavering hand, "No invention is truly great unless it begins with compassion." When he passed away later that year, the American press ran a brief obituary. Major General Malcolm C. Grow, pioneer of aviation medicine, dies at 75. But for the thousands of airmen who had once worn the M1 armor, his name was far more than a line in history. It was a symbol of resolve, of humanity amid fire, of a doctor who refused to bow to fate. His legacy lives on in every layer of composite fiber, every panel of Kevlar and ceramic worn by modern soldiers. Each time a pilot survives a crash, or a medic walks away from gunfire thanks to a bullet-resistant vest, the spirit of Malcolm Grow echoes through history, the man who dared to believe that a single piece of armor could change the nature of war. Today, at Andrews Air Force Base, the main medical center of the U.S. Air Force bears his name, the Malcolm Grow Medical Clinics and Surgery Center. On its hallway wall, his words are inscribed, "In every war, there are two battlefields, one to win victory, and one to win back human life. I chose the second." And perhaps that was his greatest victory, the triumph of compassion, intellect, and faith that even in war there is still room for humanity.